Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. A technical point I have to make before we start. Today, we are going to have the interpreting, as always, going from English to Spanish into English. In the bottom of your screen, there is a globe. In that little globe, you're going to see what language you want to listen to. This session is going to be in Spanish, but Michel Wieviorka, our colleague, who will be the first one to speak, he's going to speak in English. Whoever needs to listen to the interpretation into Spanish should go to the interpreting function. So you would have to press the button picking to listen to Spanish. So if you want to hear him in Spanish, you'll hear him in Spanish. If you pick English, you listen in English. So today is our last session. In this cycle, we were able to see from different perspectives, from different disciplines, different nationalities, different social and political aspects. We have looked at anti-Semitism. Today, we've decided that the last session is going to be a round table. Here, what we want to do is to exchange certain ideas of what is still the fundamental theoretical framework of this cycle. Anti-Semitism in Latin America from a global perspective. So we're also going to look at the time. In this cycle, we've looked at different periods in time, different countries, and I think it's very important that we continue with this ample vision. Before we start, I want to introduce our different speakers today. All of them, as I was just saying a few moments ago, all of them are known and renowned researchers, scholars in this topic. But I do want to introduce them for those of you who don't know them. So I'm going to mention some of the highlight aspects highlight points I can talk about. So I'm going to start talking about Michel Wieviorka. He was the director of studies in the École de Haute Institution in Paris. He also led the Cadiz between 1993 and 2009. He also chaired the International Sociology Association, and he's also co-director of the Collège d'Études Mondiales. He's very important in expanding the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. He also founded several periodicals, Le Monde de Débat, the Carrière Internationale de Sociologie, also the Journal of Studies of How to Come Out of Violence. Michel has concentrated in studying conflicts, terrorism, violence, racism and anti-Semitism, social movements, and multiculturalism. Among his many publications, books, articles, essays, chapters, I am going to mention Racism Space, Racism and Introduction, Racism and Anti-Semitism, Violence for a Fighting Democracy, and the last article that I have been able to read and that we shared at this event that was a very important conference is a book, Universalism Within the Tempest. And that was the name of that conference. I would also like to add that just as the other colleagues here, he's one of the most important voices of the intellectual panorama in France. We also have Sergio de la Pergola, who you have already met before because he already participated, though Michel was in our previous series. Sergio is a professor emeritus and former chairman of the Hebrew University's Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry. He's a chair of the GPR's European Jewish Demography Unit. He's also specialized in demography. He has published and edited many books and articles, among them Experiences and Perceptions of Antisemitism Among Jews in Europe. He also presented a new perspective, which is the structural vision, diaspora versus homeland. This is also one of his last publications, The Jewish Reflections on Identity and Demography. And well, he concentrates in working in historical demographics, family, international migration, Jewish identity, anti-Semitism, and the projections in diaspora and Israel. He has won the Marshall Sklar Award for Distinguished Achievement in social scientific studies. He has also had other awards. He is also has experience in publishing. So now I'm going to talk and introduce my dear colleague Leonardo Senkman. He's a professor emeritus in Latin American Studies, research fellow at the Harry S. Truman at the Hebrew University. He specialized in the socio-historic research on refugees and immigrants in Argentina. His research on human rights and anti-Semitism in Latin America. He's an expert in cultural studies and literary criticism. He's a founding member of the Association of Israeli Researchers of Latin American Judaism. He has multiple publications. I'm just going to mention a few that are very known. Jewish Identity in Argentinian Literature. It's a basic publication in this topic. Cesar Tiempo, The Fringe Neighborhoods of a Wandering Jew. He co-edited the book Human Rights in Contemporary Argentina, and he's also a co-author, together with Luis Roninger, Latin America Behind the Scenes, Conspiracy Theories, Use and Abuse. Danny Feinstein, I have to mention that each one of you, it's not just that we have worked together, that we have spoken. We have all been together for so many years. Daniel Fainstein is the Dean and Professor of Jewish Studies and Education at the Hebraic University in Mexico. He has a degree in sociology from Buenos Aires University. He has a master's in contemporary Judaism and education from the Hebrew University. And he has a PhD in political and social sciences at the Mexican National University at UNAM. And he's also had rabbinical studies. He was the dean of the Marshall T. Mayer Latin American Rabbinical Seminary. His research concentrates on intellectual and social history of Judaism, concentrating on contemporary currents in Jewish thought, the sociology of religion, and the changing dynamics in the Jewish world within the global context. He's also an editor, and he has written many publications, books, including Judaism and Human Rights and Spirituality, and Jews and Judaism in History. He also has an essay on the figure of Marshall Mayer. Well, These are the speakers today. Well, you all know me, so I don't need to introduce myself, but well, you know that I'm a distinguished professor of political science at UNAM in Mexico. I'm a member of the Academy of Sciences in Mexico, and I have edited and co-edited the Brill series, Jewish Identities in a Changing World. Well, so these are the main topics that I wanted to mention. Well, taking this idea of having this round table today, I asked our colleagues several questions or things to think about. We could talk about anti-Semitism today and its different dimensions and scales and aspects. I think that has been our objective in this cycle, which has allowed us to limit ourselves to the definitions, though we haven't been limited in the conceptions. So we have three main topics we can follow. First, what are the borders and overlaps that we have in what we would call anti Semitism, the criticism of Israel, anti Zionism, anti Semitism? What happens between criticizing the government, denying the state, and which are the legitimate spaces to talk about this? Nowadays, this has become very important after October 7th and the war. So, where are the spaces where these different concepts are being expressed? The different crises. What has been the space within academia and the campus of this debate and this discussion? And also, what is happening in Israel and in the region? What are the concepts of diaspora, polarization, internal segmentation, the fragmentation of different relationships, and also the impact this has had upon the surrounding area? So I would speak about two elements that could guide our discussion and that I would also want to talk about. First, anti Semitism, which has been the focus of this cycle, requires an analysis that will consider the multiple connections among actors, ideas, and symbols, looking at the different levels national, local, and at the world level. Everything is interconnected. The challenge is to look at the local within the global context, but also locate the global within its local context. This is what's going to allow us to avoid going into abstract universals that would not allow us to find the difference or distinguish between countries, groups, people. I also believe it's important to mark that we have tried to approach here throughout my research and also this cycle, we have to talk that anti Semitism is a complex process and it requires an analysis that goes beyond its empirical manifestations. It has structural dimensions, historical processes, and we also have to approach this looking at what is socially acceptable and what and how this threshold has changed. We could have a latent or diffuse threshold, and there's different circumstances that locate this. So I would say that we have at least three different levels. And throughout this cycle, we have been looking at. So we've been looking at attitudes. What are opinions, stereotypes? prejudices, biases. You know that this has been an important focus in my analysis, the construction of tropos. Also, we have to look at behavior or manifestations. Who are the actors? What's the practice? What are the institutional orders? And today we should look at the area of ideologies and theories. What are the visions of world, the world visions that we have here? In this sense, if we look at anti-Semitism, we can look from subjective points of view. We're talking about structure and agency and the intellectual corpus that feeds the ideologies and the theories is interacting also with social political context and different processes at different times. And what we have is that the conceptual imagery is what is giving the foundation to the practices. And their foundation is the mobilization of myths that are the ones that create this negative construction of the Jewish identity. This construction of negative tropes, their role changes and its functionality changes throughout time. Different social, economic, and political situations affect it. So now we're looking at different continuities and discontinuities of different prejudices that change or also repeat themselves. In this sense, the discourse and the practice is the channel through which anti Semitism flows. And the actors are not always aware of this. As a social process, there are symbolic mechanisms that express hate. And the expressions of hate does not mean that one is always looking at the same phenomena. But we do need to understand the reformulation and what is the permanence of different negative visions. These are sort of like different geological levels that can be interpreted in old ways, they can be replicated, or there are new ones that will come up. Today, at this session, I think that what we're all going to look at is that although we are aware of the conceptual complexity of analyzing anti Semitism, we do need to look at the different prejudices that we're having contemporarily. Looking also at anti Zionism. Where do we have this convergence? Where do we have this supercomposition, not only in the construction of meaning, but also when we are trying to see and question the existence of the state of Israel, which is something that we have lately been seeing coming from different voices that we would not have identified as anti Semitic. Well, the use of the rhetoric and the prejudiced images. I would also like to mention here that I believe that criticizing Israel and its policies, taking into account this long conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, there is a difference with the critical analysis. We have to find its context. We have to see at the causality. We have to look at the results that we see, especially now that we have this rejection of the state of Israel. So, how does this interact with the conflict itself and the behavior of its actors? This last war, the one we're living in, would bring back what Mauricio Michelin mentions, the concept of the societal war. This is a war where the battleground is really also symbolic, political. There's images, there's perceptions, the reconstruction of perceptions. And the final result is not only this military war that will mean uh, what happens in the battlefield. We could also talk about the inequality of the conditions because you will have this alternative triumph in the symbolical battleground where we're talking about theology at the international level. I think there's so much more that can be said about this. What would be the way that the different society levels are participating in this? And we can see that if we're looking at the axis of anti-Semitism, each one of these military battles that Israel has been fighting does affect the international perception, which is one of the objectives of Hamas. And I would say that in the general environment of the perception, there is not really a direct understanding of what is Hamas, what is its relationship with Hezbollah, what is the relationship with Iran. So we are facing a very complex situation, and the behavior of the different actors brings us to different things of what will happen the next day. I really don't want to speak much, but I do want to say that this space belongs to you. So please, I want to hear all of you. Let's start with our dialogue. Michel, please. You can speak if you want to hear him in Spanish. You pick in the interpreting function, pick Spanish. If you want to hear him in English, please, you will speak here, hear me here.
Well,
If you want to hear in English, stay here. See, if we want to listen in English, you press English. If you want to hear Spanish, speak Spanish.
Perdón por esta. O sea, aquí queremos oír a Michelle en inglés, aprendemos inglés. Y si lo queremos oír en español, oiremos a Edith Cassés en su traducción.
thank you. Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you for inviting me and organizing this wonderful moment, which is a global moment since you are in Mexico, others are in Israel, I am in Paris. And so I would like to start with two remarks. My first remark is that contemporary anti Semitism is more global than ever as a phenomenon. And when I say global, I also mean with regional, national, and local differences, of course. If you look at Eastern Europe, it's not the same than at Western Europe, not exactly the same in Latin America, in the Middle East, and so on. But of course, these are not distinguished parts of the world. All forms of anti-Semitism are interconnected. There are a lot of interpenetrations, overlapping, and so on. So this is for me obvious. The second, in this first remark, I would like to insist on three dimensions. The first one is that today, this global anti-Semitism is highly political and highly politicized, which is not always so strong in other moments in recent history. Today, it's a highly political issue. My second point here is that it is connected with new place for the Shoah in the general discourse in our societies everywhere. If you are in the 80s or the 90s, Shoah is a very, very strong appeal to consideration, to comprehension, to opening mind being opened and so on. Today it's different, and what happens, which is absolutely important, is that today we almost don't have any more living memory of the Shoah. Most of the survivors, family, and so on are disappearing. We only have very, very, very old people that cannot visit schools, for instance, to explain to young people what was really at stake. And we don't have also no more guilty people. We don't have more trials with these people that were acting in Auschwitz or this kind of thing. So there is no room for living memory. There is room for history, but this is a big change. And so there is a generation gap, and this is also everywhere like this, which is very important. And the third point here is that everything here is connected with what happens with Israel, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Arab relations and conflicts, and of course what is happening in the Middle East, Iran, and so on. So, and this is why anti-Zionism sometimes is exactly the same as anti-Semitism. I will say later that it's not exactly the same. Now, I would like to say a few words about what is happening in my country, in France, where is living the second more important Jewish population out of Israel. The first one are the United States, and then it's France. We don't know exactly. Maybe Sergio will tell us more precisely, but maybe 400 or 500,000 Jews live in France. So what are the characteristics of anti-Semitism in my country? First of all, we experiment what I would call metapolitical anti-Semitism, that is to say, terrorism. We have terrorists acting with anti-Semitic discourses very clearly. It started at least in 2012 with Mohamed Merah. It's not today. And we have many other cases. Then, second characteristic, we have many, many anti-Semitic behaviors. Small acts, not so small, but limited acts, not meta-political, not political, but I would say more social, more in the society. We have an increase, a very important increase of these acts. For instance, people that try to burn a synagogue, people that write something on a wall, people that are rude with a rabbi somewhere in a bar. I mean, small events at the scale of a country, but a lot of them. This phenomenon started in the very early years of this century, but with October the 7th, it became very, very high. As a second characteristic of France. The third point, and this is maybe surprising, is that several surveys show that there are less prejudice, no more, but less prejudice against Jews, generally speaking, in the French society. So it's very strange. More acts, less prejudice. And of course, we should here say a few words about social networks, because you have a lot of hatred circulating on social networks. Now, a very important point is that the extreme right in France, when it is institutionalized, that is to say, going in the parliament, having deputies and so on, this extreme right says now, we love Israel and we are defending Jews, we hate anti-Semitism. This is absolutely recent, not totally new, but recent. It started maybe 8 or 10 years ago with Marine Le Pen, the daughter of her father. The father was a real anti-Semitic person. The daughter says, no, We finish with this. We love Israel. We love Jews, and so on. And this is very important because it does not mean that all the voters and all the members of this party and so on are like that. It's the top of the party which is like that. But you have many, many anti-Semitic people, prejudice and so on among these people. But there is a new tendency which is clear. This is French, but not only. Another point which is very important in France, and this is highly political, what we could call the left of the left. We have a very important political party which is called La France Insoumise. This is their name. The leader is rather famous, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is proposing an anti-Zionism which is clearly connected with anti-Semitism, not for religious reasons, not for cultural reasons, but for electoral reasons. They want to have a new constituency. They want to have all these migrants from Arab or Muslim countries that are now living in France and that become French. They want to have them vote for them. So to have them with them, these migrants or sons of migrants, these people listen that the leader and the people in the France Insoumise say, vote for us. We are fighting against Israel and so on. So then, and this will be my last 2 points because I don't want to talk too much, but my last 2 points at that stage. First of all, there is a huge tendency connected with this issue of anti-Semitism today, a huge tendency of disappearance of public debate, which is what Judith said also, and disappearing, not only disappearing of public debate, but ethnicization of the political life. When I speak, usually as a sociologist, I am a sociologist in my country, where universal values are very important. But today, when I speak, people say, you are Jewish. And but not only people say. Recently, my sister Annette, who is very famous for her work on Nuremberg and so on, and she asked me to sign a manifesto in a very important newspaper, Le Monde, starting by a sentence, something like, "We, Juifs de gauche, Jews connected with the left." And I did not want to say no because the content of the paper was good, but I had some difficulties to sign because it makes me appearing, because of my decision, not other decision, but my appearing as Juif de gauche, left and Jewish. So this is a real problem because we don't only have the destruction of the public debate, we have a kind of ethnicization of the public debate. And I will say, and Judith will appreciate, those people that could discuss together 10 or 15 years ago as Palestinians living in France or as Israelis living in France that could discuss, and it could be wonderful. We had this, you remember, these people today don't talk together. So even the best people on both sides have huge difficulties to talk. So these are my points. And the very, very last point is that the extreme right ideological production, anti-Semitic production, for instance, we have a very famous writer whose name is Soral, Alain Soral. So he writes on social networks, of course, because he cannot do it as such. So these people are read by people from migrant, Arab, or Muslim origin, which means the ideas, the theorization of hatred may come also from very, very ultra or extreme right, being accepted by people very different. So this is the general landscape, and the problem is that it's difficult today in my country, like in many others, of course, and not only universities, but also in universities, like in your case. Thank you.
Okay. I think I have to change, right, to Spanish, and I
Yes.
do it immediately. Muchas gracias, Michelle. Mira,
Thank you, Michelle.
realmente lo que señalas
What you have
es muy
mentioned
importante. Muy
is
bien,
very
recordé, cómo
important.
no, aquel encuentro
I
donde
remember that
de lo
encounter.
que era el otoño de la política, la
It was
publicación fue la
the fall
primavera de la
of
política,
politics, and
donde el
the
diálogo que se dio fue espléndido, el
publication was the
capítulo
spring
del
of
diálogo
politics. And we had this chapter
israelí-israelí
of
fue
the
muy
dialogue.
importante.
It was very
Bueno,
important.
yo creo que lo que señalas es muy importante.
I
No
think that
quiero
what you have been
tomar
mentioning
más
is very
tiempo
important. I don't
y
want
pedirle
to
ahora a Sergio,
take
por
more time. So
favor.
I would like Sergio, please, to speak.
Gracias, Judith.
Thank you, Judy.
Hoy es claro que estamos
It's
inmersos
clear
en una gran
that we
guerra.
are immersed in
Es
a
una guerra total
big
en
war.
tres
It's a total
frentes.
war
Cada uno de
facing
estos
three
tres
fronts.
frentes
Each one
implica
of
un
these three
análisis y
fronts
una estrategia operativa
requires
diferente.
a
Pero
different
antes
analysis and
de
a different
nada,
strategy.
es necesario definir el
But first of
perímetro de
all,
cada
we
uno de los
need to
frentes,
define the
comprender la
perimeter of each one
naturaleza
of
de
these
los
fronts
problemas,
to
los
understand the
posibles
nature of the
instrumentos de
problems,
intervención,
the
incluso
possible
las
ways of
ilusiones
intervening,
de la
and
que
even
partimos
to
y que
consider
hoy
the
debemos
illusions
revisar
we're starting
radicalmente.
from. And we do
El
have
primer
to
frente es el más
revise
intenso de los
radically.
combates en el
The
propio
first
territorio de
front is the
Israel,
most
en Irán,
important one.
Gaza, Líbano,
That's
Yemen,
happening in
Siria
Israel, in
y
Iran,
otros
Gaza,
lugares.
Lebanon,
Los
Yemen,
hemos
Syria, and other
visto en
places.
estos últimos
And we have seen
increíbles
this
12
these
días de guerra.
incredible
La
last
gran
12
ilusión
days
aquí
of
se
war.
refería a la
The
presencia
big
judía e
illusion
israelí
here
y a
was
sus
talking
relaciones
about
con
the
los
Jewish
demás
and
pueblos
Israeli
y las
presence and its
civilizaciones del Oriente
relationships with
Medio.
other
¿Por
peoples
qué
and
amerita
civilizations in
aclarecer
the
que el
Middle
concepto de
East.
Oriente
It's
Medio está
important to
evidentemente
mention here
calibrado
that this
desde
concept
la
of the Middle
perspectiva
East
analítica
has
geopolítica
been
eurocéntrica?
calibrated
Esta
through a
etiqueta
Eurocentric
representa una
analytic
condición
perspective.
generalizada que, ignorando la
This
esfericidad de la
label
Tierra, asigna el
represents a
punto de
generalized
referencia
convention,
principal
and
a
it's
una
not
zona
really thinking
determinada del
of the
globo y
Earth
relativiza
as
cualquier
a
otra
sphere,
referencia geográfica.
and
En
it's
realidad,
really
geográficamente,
relativized. It
Oriente Medio
puts into a
forma parte de
relativity
Asia
the different
Occidental, al igual que
aspects of
Europa,
geography.
relativizada a partir de
The Middle
Asia,
East
no
is part
sería
of
otra cosa
Asia.
que el Oeste Medio,
So it's
o tomando
actually
América del
not,
Norte
if you
como
look
el
at it
lejano Oeste.
from
América
Asia,
del
we're talking
Norte
about the
además
West, and
geográficamente
the Middle East
también
would
se
be the
encuentra muy
far
al
West.
este de Asia.
And we see that
Estas
North
categorías
America is also
inventadas,
very,
obviamente, no
very
solo
far
tienen
west,
relevancia formal,
far
sino que
east.
implican
Well,
hipótesis de
these
juicio
categories that have
muy
been
precisas
invented
sobre la naturaleza
are
de los procesos
important
que
because
tienen
they
lugar en
talk
cada uno
about
de
the
estos
nature of the
diferentes
processes that are
lugares.
happening in each one
Edward
of these
Said
different
lo
places.
expresó
Edward
bien en
Said
su obra
mentioned this in
Orientalismo.
his work
En particular, es común
Orientalism.
creer en Occidente
In
que las
the West, we
transacciones que tienen
believe
lugar en
that what
Oriente Medio
happens in the Middle
se
East
rigen por impulsos menos
is
racionales, por
comes from
decisiones
impulses
basadas
that
más en
are not
instintos
really regional, but they're
descontrolados,
more
por
really come from
sensibilidades más ocultas,
instinct or
por una
from
asunción de
very
riesgos
obtuse
desorbitada,
sensitivities,
por
or
una mayor
because people are
crueldad
really
e
taking big
indiferencia
risks,
ante
or
el
there's
dolor ajeno
cruelty
y en última
and
instancia por una
indifference before
insuficiente
the
consideración
suffering of
de lo que sería
others.
el bien
And
común,
it's really
de la
not
presunta
considering what is the
universalidad
better good
de la sociedad
or
humana
of
en su
the
conjunto. Universalidad
supposed
de la que
universality of
obviamente
humanity.
Occidente
This
es el
universality,
custodio
of
exclusivo.
course, the
En
West is the
verdad,
one
en
that is in
cierto
charge of.
proceso de
The
normalización
truth is
atlántico
that
en curso,
if we
como los
look at
acuerdos
the
de Abraham,
normalization,
nos había llevado a
like
creer que
the
Israel sería
Abraham
aceptada en la
Accords,
Asamblea
we
de los
had
Pueblos de
believed
la
that
región.
Israel
A
would be
cambio,
accepted among the
descubrimos
peoples
que
of
el
this
proyecto
region.
de rechazo y
Nevertheless, we
genocidio
saw
seguía
that
muy
the
vigente, con
rejection
la
and the
cabeza del
genocide
serpiente
was still
claramente en
there,
Irán y
with
sus metástasis en
Iran
todos los países de la
heading
región
this
y las
and being spread
perturbadoras
out through all
relaciones de
the other countries in
vasallaje
the
y
region.
señorío con Rusia, en
And
parte también con
also
China y
the
Corea del Norte.
relationships
La guerra en Gaza y
subordinated to
Líbano
Russia
desveló la
and to China and North
fanfarronería de la
Korea. The
omnipotencia
war in
militar
Gaza
israelí,
and
pero también
Lebanon
la
really
admiración por el
showed the
inmenso
military
heroísmo de sus
omnipotence
jóvenes
of
combatientes.
the
A
Israeli
pesar de los
army,
horrores del
but
7 de
we also
octubre
saw
y de
the
la
horror
inevitable y más
and
que
the
proporcionada
heroism
reacción de
of
Israel,
its fighters. In spite of what happened on October 7, the time for negotiation to end this mutual destruction had not ended, but the responsibility of the following stages was not an imaginary peace. It was really something that is really, sorry, I need to tell him to speak more.
El segundo frente es el internacional, que se desarrolla a nivel de imagen, de política, de medios de comunicación, de la delgada
The
línea que
second
separa y
international
une a
front
Israel del mundo de las comunidades judías.
that is, sorry, perdón, no puede, the interpreter cannot go.
Debemos tener muy presente la diada observador observado. Cualquiera tiene ¿Qué pasa? No siento nada.
You are speaking too fast.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasó?
Sergio, ¿me oyes? ¿Me oyes?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
The interpreter needs him to read slower.
Perdón, yo tenía el micrófono apagado.
The interpreter is asking you that you have to read slower.
Okay.
Claro, porque
She
me
cannot keep
cuesta
up.
trabajo seguirte.
She cannot keep up.
Entonces, ¿dónde estamos? Necesita ampliar el horizonte de observación.
The observation horizon
tiene
needs to
derecho
be
a
widened.
observar una situación determinada.
Anyone has the right to
en el
observe
marco
a
de una
determined
diada observador
situation.
observado.
And as an
Nosotros
observer, you
estamos
can look at
los
things.
observados generalmente.
We are being
Siempre es
observed
legítimo
usually.
abrir
It's
un
always
debate sobre
legitimate
estos juicios, pero al
to
mismo
enter a
tiempo,
debate
quien es
regarding
observado
this.
también
But at the
tiene
same
derecho a
time,
emitir un
whoever
juicio
is being
sobre el
observed
observador,
has also
sobre
the
su
right
contexto,
to
sobre sus
speak about the
herramientas.
observer, about their
Este
context,
contrajuicio
about their
simétrico
tools.
también
So
debería formar
this
parte del debate
asymmetrical
para que
difference should be a
adquiera
part
mayor
of the debate
substancia y
to give it
validez.
more substance and
Hoy,
more
muchos
value.
intelectuales occidentales
Today,
argumentan
many
que
Western
hay
intellectuals
tres
state
cuestiones
that there are
básicas que
three basic
caracterizan la
issues
fase actual del conflicto
that
en Oriente Medio y que están
explain
estrechamente
the
relacionadas
actual
entre sí.
situation in the Middle
Uno,
East.
la
One,
ineludible centralidad
the
de la cuestión
centrality
palestina.
of
Dos,
the
el
Palestinian
equilibrio de poder
issue.
regional y su
Two,
legitimidad
the
política.
balance of in
Tres,
the
la
regional power
dimensión
and its political
internacional en la
legitimacy.
forma
And three, the
específica de
international
la
dimension,
alianza entre Israel y
specifically
Estados
looking
Unidos.
at the alliance between
Pero
the
desde
United States
Jerusalén
and
me
Israel.
gustaría proponer
But me,
una
from
línea de
Jerusalem, I
argumentación
would
no solo
like to
alternativa,
add
sino complementaria
a
a las tres
complementary
cuestiones básicas
issue
que
that I think that we
caracterizan
should
la fase
add.
actual del discurso en
There are these
Europa y
three
en las
main
Américas y que están estrechamente
threads that are
relacionadas
part of the
entre sí.
discourse in
Uno,
Europe and in the
la
Americas.
amnesia
One,
generalizada
there's this
tanto de los
generalized
valores morales y
amnesty,
civiles fundacionales
amnesia
como de sus propias
regarding the
identidades
moral
culturales.
and civil
Dos,
values
la
and
alineación
thinking
de la
in the
izquierda
cultural
intelectual y
identities.
política
Two,
con
the
posiciones
aligning of
ideológicas
the left,
totalmente
the
opuestas a su
intellectual and
condición y
political
razón
left,
de ser.
with ideological
Tres,
positions
la
that are
adhesión de
completely
muchas
opposed to their
élites
own
intelectuales y
traditions.
políticas
And three,
a
the adhesion
posiciones,
of many
intereses
intellectual and political
incompatibles con sus
elites
visiones y la
to
transición de estas élites
interests and
de
positions that
creadores
are totally
independientes de ideas
incompatible with
a
their role.
consumidores
And these
dependientes de
elites
slogans.
are
La
passing
gran
from being
ilusión en este
independent
sentido
creators of
se
ideas and
refería
they're
a
becoming
la esencia
dependent
intelectual y espiritual del
consumers of
mundo occidental.
slogans. In this sense,
Después, y a pesar de la
we were
Shoah,
talking about the
esperábamos que
spiritual and
Occidente,
intellectual
que la
essence
concibió
of
y
the
ejecutó,
Western world.
se hubiera
After the
arrepentido,
Shoah, we
que había
expected that the
metabolizado
Occident
la intolerancia, sino la
would have
intolerancia hacia
repented
la
and would
causa
have
vocacional
metabolized
del lema
intolerance
nunca
and
más.
be really
Pero
against
el nunca
and would
más
not
estaba de
become
nuevo entre nosotros,
and should
en amplios sectores de
understand
la
what
sociedad,
was
en
the
el mundo en
foundation of the
general
slogan never
y
again.
en los
But this never again came back. The legitimacy of the three fundamental ingredients of being a Jew in these days, same dignity, autonomy, autonomous memory, and political sovereignty. All of this is once again being questioned. The exploitation of the word Zionism was used to condemn all of the Jewish people for crimes that had never been committed. This rejection of Israel becomes the rejection of the local Jew. The non-critical support of Islamic fundamentalists is coming about, subordinating the values of democracy, tolerance, justice, and pluralism, which should always be at the center of the perception of a society that considers itself to be enlightened. The third front is internal. How Israel is handling its politics, its democracy, its future. The Great Illusion was referring to the history and the meaning of Israel as the Jewish state and as the center of the world Jewish people. We had fooled ourselves, believing that after more than 77 years of independence, Israel was going towards its maturity and to a consolidated welfare, which would include the capacity of self-criticism and to implement necessary reforms that had been left behind since the difficult beginnings of creating a state. On the eve of October 7th, the country was very divided after the legal reforms and constitutional reforms that Netanyahu's government brought about. Hundreds of thousands of people were demonstrating out on the street against this new totalitarian route. So this made the Arab leaders to believe mistakenly that the divided Israel could be easily attacked and destroyed. But the day, in moments of crisis, the response of the country was overwhelming. There was solidarity in the country, at least for a time. The extraordinary resilience of Israel during a crisis was the first light that came about from this chaos. And we can also say this, the aggregation of Israeli society that is right now under the Iranian bombardment. In his last speech to the country, Netanyahu mentioned that there are still many topics that remain pending. So this means that he will be a candidate for many more years as prime minister. But it also is also having him continue with full force in his project to reduce the judiciary, the judicial power, and turn it into an instrument of the executive branch. And also the discrimination between those who work and pay taxes and serve in the army and those who don't. Netanyahu said the people shall decide, and that's what the future will be determined. The future of Israel will be determined. Thank you very much, Sergio. So we have different perspectives, different analysis, and we're going to debate about this in a moment. So Leonardo, please. Leonardo, you have to unmute yourself, turn on your microphone. Can you hear me now? I want to bring about some of the topics that have already been mentioned and also talk about some of the scenes of the war, points that Sergio mentioned. But my work concentrates in analyzing the responses to anti-Semitism from Jewish organizations, regional Jewish organizations, and Israel. And there has been a criticism against certain responses to anti-Semitism. I would say that discourse of war gives the format to the response of the Jewish organizations at the local level in order to confront the speech against Israel. And also we have to look about the anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist discourse. The discourse against the war is used only as within the different Jewish organizations, but it's also part of the discourse in political discourse in the country, especially in Brazil and Chile. A type of response that I have been analyzing of hate speech against Israel has to do with those who are not really considering that it's very politicized discourse that has been spread out not only by transnational social networks, but it's also been transmitted by international groups that are anti-globalization, usually this global south against the northern globe. So these people are using the flag in favor of the Palestinian cause. And this has been happening for many years, even before October 7th. I want to remind you that the yearly meetings of the World Social Forum that started in 2002 in Porto Alegre, in Brazil, they continue having this forum, not only in Brazil. And the fourth analytical level that I want to mention is the response of local Jewish communities, also international groups, and in Israel. The response to publications and words of groups from the diaspora that have come about to criticize Israel, especially after October 7th. So I'm going to see what I have time to mention. I want to stress that if during the first Cold War, anti-Semitism in Latin America was working to serve anti-communism from the right, and all the anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist tropes in the left were coming from Russia and the socialists and the Soviet Union. I want to mention that nowadays the current tropes against the war and the anti-globalization from the global south against the global north, they are using these post-colonial theories very much. And they are using the military alliance between Israel and the United States in a way that had not been used before. Because right now it's using as a probe to work with the anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic tropes. So the response of local or international groups are not effective because they're not deconstructing the new tropes of these national and international groups. I want to remind you that the response of most of the Jewish organizations today continue using this old traditional strategy to combat anti-Semitism in Latin America, requesting anti-discrimination laws and to ask from justice to have criminal action against defamation. And this is a strategy that has not been actually written officially in history. But these last years, what we're seeing is this response that we call the judiciarization, with legal complaints against those who commit hate speech. So I want to mention the Argentinian case. We can see two different causes before the law that happened with hate speech against Israel. These cases were processed through legislation, through anti-discrimination laws. And the government of Argentina adopted the definition of anti-Semitism from the IHRA. Well, I'm going to mention these two legal cases. One was when the former legislator Alejandro Godard was put in a suspended sentence of 6 months for several tweets that he published in 2022, where he said that Israel was a genocidal and racist state. This person, he leads the workers' socialist movement. This legal cause, this suit was saying that it was violating the anti-discrimination law, and they asked to judge him according to the definition of anti-Semitism from the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. He had already been absolved twice, in May of 2023 and then in August of 2024. But the last point was that there was an appeal. And in April of 2025, he was sentenced with 2 votes against 1. And this legal case is going on because the attorneys want to take this case up to the Supreme Court. The second case of bringing the anti-Semitic speech to the judiciary was a deputy in the Congress who also was using anti-Zionism as a political weapon. It's interesting to note that in April this year, this representative, when she was processed by a very important judge in Argentina, who's well known by Jews in Argentina and also by the Argentinian government, it's the federal judge Daniel Fainstein. In the indictment, he says that the deputy is disturbing freedom of speech when it demands actions from Israel that are different from the actions that are demanded from any other state where the religion is part of their constitution. The other topic that I have been analyzing is anti-Semitism or anti-Israelism in the social networks. We see, and especially here in Latin America, where we have the Web Observatory in AMIA, we see that the most dangerous discourses and speech against Israel, against Zionism or anti-Semitic are within the government. So here we see that bringing things to the judiciary really don't have the effect that one would wish. It doesn't even localize those who are really using hate speech. To me, it's very important to note, because the report of anti-Semitism in the web in Uruguay, which is a small country, which has a very small Jewish community, has 1/4 of the commentaries that appeared in the Uruguayan social media. So proportionally, we can see that anti-Semitic posts in Uruguay are 29% 0.7% of the whole region, where the regular percentage in the rest of the region was 17%. So what we are looking at is the vandalizing of community buildings, like the new Israelite congregation. There, the walls of the building are used to speak against Israel and say that it's a genocide state. The issue we're looking at is how in Uruguay we can see new forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and how we can compare them with the old traditional ways, where Jews are being accused and threatened that they're going to be burned, where they mark university students. And this discourse, 4 years after this, for first time, a Jew is murdered. It was a violent anti-Semitic act that did not happen, that hadn't happened like that anything lately in Argentina. This has to do with a combination of the old style of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic actions with new ways that have come about within the situation with the war. And all this joins the old traditional anti-Semitic tropes. But there's another aspect that I also want to analyze and mention. One of my criticisms of the way that Israel is responding to anti-Semitism has been this fallacy of the Israeli government that responded to anti-Semitism with a strategic alliance with the extreme right in Europe and in Latin America. You know that in March there was a conference this year organized by the Israeli government. This conference in March on international anti-Semitism brought about a change in the political narrative, not only of the right in Europe, where they are organizing a campaign to fight anti-Semitism, but it's also something new that was brought against Islamic and Arab anti-Semitism, and this was organized by the diaspora group. When you call Leonardo Della, who is the leader of the extreme right party in France, and they are called about to create an alliance in order to combat anti-Semitism. Of course, on the left in Latin America, they brought about an argument that's being used to see these are the allies of Israel, and we want to fight against all of them. And my sixth and last point in analyzing the response to anti-Semitism is to look the discourse that is opposing the global south to the north, to the global north. This is a topic that hasn't really been analyzed by Jewish organizations or Jewish studies. We are used to going to the anti-Semitic tropes in the Soviet area or anti-Semitic tropes globally. But when we're talking about social organizations, when we're talking about the organizations of the global south, and they adopt the Palestinian flag as a fight, not only against globalization that is promoting the global north, it's very important to me that we should consider that when we're talking and criticizing the anti-Israeli, they're accusing Milei as an anti-Semitic. He's been declared a persona non grata when he did compare when he compared and used the word of genocide and compared it with what happened in World War II. But then we see Lula, who's a leader of the global South, who is being demonized as an anti-Semite. The general director of Yad Vashem accused him of this. And the CONIF, which is the Federation of Jewish Communities in Brazil. And they said that Lula, that his discourse is promoting anti-Semitism. I think that this type of criticism is what we should be analyzing when we try to analyze certain responses to anti-Semitism without analyzing or understanding this phenomenon. And we're also not putting it within context. This also happened in Chile. I would like to speak a bit more about this, but I will just try to mention, if we're talking about tropes and we're talking about language, we have to also talk about words. And the words also become weapons. The words in the discourse, the tropes, metaphors, tropes, rhetorical tropes. If you work with anti-Semitism, you have to also look at the language. When the president of Chile gave a very strong statement against Israel, and the community got organized against him. And there are two words that are very important, two words that are correct. They said they were the denigrating adjectives were used to criticize Israel. It's one thing to say that these are degrading adjectives. It's different from saying that he's an anti-Semitic. The difference between a president who's an anti-Semite or a president who uses adjectives, denigrating adjectives, if we analyze it as semiologists, we do have to talk about this. To conclude, I want to mention the new publications or intellectuals' expressions coming from Jewish intellectuals. I'm not talking from the left, from the non-Jewish left. And what is being written because of Gaza. I'm just going to mention one case. I'm not going to analyze it, but want you to know. A Jewish philosopher who was also a Zionist when he was young, and he was in Chile also. Eduardo Sabrowski. He wrote a book, a very polemical and critical book, but it's not an anti-Semitic book, though he's being accused of this. The book is Israel and Gaza, the historical crossroads of Judaism. This is a very controversial book, and we might not agree with what he writes, but we can say that this is an anti-Semitic author. And if I'm using this example, we can also talk about what happens in Mexico, to what happens in Chile, what happens in Argentina, what happens in other countries, and what happens with a very important historian who we criticize, Héctor Traverso, who wrote a very critical book against the war in Gaza. But I cannot say that it's an anti-Semitic book, and I want to conclude with that. Leo, I apologize. We have the problem with our time, and I really apologize that I had to interrupt you. What you have been presenting is very important, but we've gone beyond our time. We'll have to organize another meeting, but I want to ask Danny to give his presentation.
No, no,
Thank you.
una palabra.
Just one
Enzo
thing.
Traverso es un antisemita.
Enzo Traverso, he is an anti-Semite.
Bueno, esta es la parte, si ustedes quieren,
Well,
tras que acabe Dani, no sé cuánto
after
tiempo, perdí
Danny
un
will
poco
speak, I've lost the.
la contabilidad, entonces a lo
I
mejor
am no
solo
longer, I
pediría a
think
Dani
I
que,
lost. I'll ask Danny
Siete
to
minutos por cronómetro.
7
bueno, te
minutes.
agradezco mucho. Y
Ok.
luego vamos
Thank you. And then
a esto que dijo Sergio, lo que
we'll
dijo
we'll talk to what
Leo.
Sergio
Adelante.
mentioned and Leo.
Ok.
So Daniel,
Bueno, ante
please.
todo, para mí es un gusto
Well,
estar
it's a
en esta
pleasure
mesa
to be able
con
to be here in this
maestros y
roundtable
colegas queridos,
with
así que es un gusto. En segundo
professors
lugar,
and
quiero
dear
tocar
colleagues.
cuatro puntos
I want to
brevemente.
talk about
El primero
4
tiene que ver con el
topics. The
nombre.
first one has to do with the
Sergio de la
name.
Pergola planteó en otro encuentro,
Sergio
en
de la
anteriores
Pendola
encuentros, que
mentioned
tenemos
in
que
a
buscar una
different
nueva
presentation,
terminología
we
para
have to find
referirnos a
a
este
new
fenómeno del
terminology
odio
when we're trying
antijudío.
to talk
Es decir,
about
ya no se usa más, por ejemplo, el término
the
marrano para hablar de los
anti-Jewish
judíos
hate.
conversos.
For
No
example, we
se
no
usa
longer
más el
use the
término
term marrano
falashas
to
para
talk
referirse
about
a los judíos de
conversos
Etiopía,
Jews.
pero
We no
seguimos
longer
usando
use
un término
falashas to
equivalente
speak
de
about
gativo,
Ethiopian Jews. Well, we still are using
antisemitismo, que se
this
origina como un término
the
derogativo. Y por
this
otro
term
lado, es un
anti-Semit,
término que no da cuenta
anti-Semitism.
de la
And
enorme
it's a term
complejidad
that does
del
not
campo de lo
really
que queremos describir, de que incluye un montón de
include
elementos
the
tanto de
complexity of
antisemitismo,
this field. There's
antijudío,
so
antisemitismo.
many
Creo que este es un
things
tema
that
que no es menor,
this
buscar un término
single
o
word,
términos
the single
más
term
adecuados que den
is trying
cuenta
to
de la
encompass. We need to
complejidad
find better
del
terms and more
fenómeno.
terms
En
that
segundo
will
lugar,
express the
siguiendo un poco a
complexity
Leo,
of this
que
phenomenon.
planteó, hay una
Following
enorme
what Leo
diversidad en
mentioned,
América Latina
there's a
que
new
tiene que ver, por un
diversity
lado,
in Latin America that has to do
las políticas oficiales de los
with the
gobiernos frente al
official
conflicto
policies
israelí-palestino.
of
Tenemos
the
los países
different
aislados
governments
claramente del
regarding
eje
the
más
Israeli
radical,
Palestinian policy.
Venezuela,
We have the most
Cuba,
radical
Nicaragua, que están bajo los
area,
radar. Después tenemos
Venezuela,
países como
Cuba,
Chile,
Nicaragua, and then we have
Brasil y
countries like
otros que
Chile,
están también en una
Brazil, and
línea
others that are
crítica. Y después
in
tenemos
a
algunas
critical
excepciones
line.
raras
And then
como
we
El
have
Salvador,
certain
Argentina, donde hay una
exceptions, such as El
política, una
Salvador and
identificación
Argentina,
muy
where
clara
their policy
desde la
is
jerarquía política, y eso
pro-Israel
genera a
in
su vez
the
distintas reacciones
political
de las instituciones
hierarchy.
comunitarias,
So
por un
this
lado,
also
pero es cierto
presents the
algo que
different
dijeron
position
varios,
of the
lo dijo Michel, lo
communities.
dijo
But just like Michel
Sergio, lo
or
dijeron Richelman,
Sergio
la
and
globalización
Leonardo
de las
mentioned,
redes. Ahí ya
this
no hay
globalization of the
discrepancias en los
networks, there
discursos
we do find all the similarities
israelíes como tales.
in
Habría que
the
pensar ahora, tal
anti-Israeli
vez en América Latina no
position.
tuvo la virulencia
There's
las
this
manifestaciones
topic that
públicas
maybe
como
wasn't
las que
so
tuvieron en Europa,
aggressive in
tal vez
Latin
porque
America
primero
as
no
in
hay
Europe.
importantes
First
minorías
of all,
islámicas
because we
en
don't
América
have
Latina.
important Islamic
Tal vez
Muslim
porque los
minorities in Latin
desafíos
America.
económicos y políticos
Maybe
globales
also the
son tan
difference was
intensos
the
y tan caóticos que la gente está más
challenges.
absorta con estos
The
desafíos
local
que con lo que
challenges are
pasa
so important,
lejanamente
and
para
people
la
are
mayoría de la
concentrating more on
población.
those
Y
economical
también
and
podríamos
political
decir que la
challenges
sociedad en América
than in what's
Latina
happening
está
far
muy
away.
fuertemente
And
integrada
also,
en
what
la
we
vida
have is
cultural,
that the
política
Jews in
y
Latin
social
America
de
are
algunos lugares como
very
por
well
ejemplo Argentina.
integrated in the
El diálogo
social and
interconfesional ha sido fuerte,
political
está muy
life
desarrollado y
of
eso
their
ayuda
countries.
de
And in
alguna forma a
Argentina,
frenar.
there's
Habría que
also a
verlo.
very
Lo
good
planteo como una
dialogue between
hipótesis
different
como tal. Y
religions.
tenemos
And
dentro
maybe
de
that has
Migrante
also
quienes han
helped.
salido del
So
frente
that's a
a
hypothesis I
criticar
would like to
las
present.
declaraciones del
We
gobierno.
also
El
have
caso para mí muy fuerte es
groups
lo que
that
ha
have
pasado en
come
Chile, lo
out
que ha pasado en
to
Cuba, en
criticize the
muchos
actions of the
ejemplos
government, like what
criticar
happened in Chile, what happened in
claramente
Cuba.
las
They
declaraciones de la
clearly
secretaria de Relaciones Exteriores u
criticized the
otros, en
statements of
Chile también.
the
Y lo que habría que
with
pensar,
their
y nosotros en un estudio que
statements
hicimos
also in Chile
previamente,
against
vimos
Israel.
que la gran
In the
mayoría
previous
de los
study, we
judíos en
were
América
able to
Latina
see
se
that
sentían
the great
cómodos en su
majority of
integración
Jews
entre
in
su
Latin
condición
America
de judíos
felt
y su
comfortable
condición de ciudadanos de sus
integrating
países,
their
salvo
condition as
Chile,
Jews
que
and their
había más
condition as
tensiones.
citizens
La
in their
pregunta sería,
country,
después del 7 de
except for
octubre,
Chile.
si eso ha
The new
cambiado o
question
no
is if
en
this
términos
has
del
changed
sentimiento de
after October
integración
7th, this
nacional
feeling
o
of
no, de la misma
national
forma que
integration,
era antes del 7
if
de
it's
octubre.
remains being the same
Ante
as
último
it was
punto, quiero
before
plantear
October
este
7th.
dato.
The last
Muchos de
point I would
ustedes
like to
conocerán el
mention,
estudio de
many
Edward
of you
Kaplan
know the
que se
study
llamó
written by
Anti-Israel
Edward Campbell
Sentiment Predicts
that was called
Antisemitism in Europe.
Anti-Israel Sentiment
Un
Predicts
estudio,
Anti-Semitism in
digamos,
Europe.
que
This study
establece que existe una
establishes
correlación
that there
muy
is
alta entre
a
los
very
discursos
high
antisemitas
correlation
y los
between
discursos
anti-Semitic discourse and anti-Israel discourse. I think that we do need to have more of these empirical studies here as they've been done in Europe, because it's a clear way to construct, like Leo said, to look at this discourses, to see that discourse that's against Israel or that's anti-Semitism could predict anti-Semitic discourse and anti-Semitic speeches. We can't affirm it right now because we need more data. We need to analyze this. But this would bring a study, would give us better evidence. And now the central part of what I want to say. I do believe that in Latin America, but not only in Latin America, we are approaching a perfect storm regarding the strength of anti-Semitic discourse. In Jerusalem, a while ago, some years ago, when I was studying 40 years ago in Israel, there was this evening where Yehuda Bauer was talking about anti-Semitism and its dangers, and another talk with George Mose, who was also talking there. So here they presented two different postures. For Mose, the key is the symbolic construction coming from cultural and ideological elites. That's the dangerous point. If ideological and cultural elites start developing anti Semitic discourse, this will be normalized and will become accepted. On the other hand, Yehuda Bauer was saying that anti Semitism becomes dangerous when the social structure of a country is decomposed and there are no longer moral and institutional limits. I think that at this point in time, we are approaching a time when both of these factors are coinciding. We have the intellectual elites and the discourse, the anti Semitic discourse, anti Israel discourse from the cultural elites, and the political elites are assuming this discourse. And where we also find ourselves in societies that are decomposed by violence and their social structure, all of this will generate a very risky environment because we have these two conditions: what's happening in the discourse of the elites and what's happening in the social decomposition. So we are really approaching this perfect storm where we have these structural factors and ideological factors are coinciding. Thank you, Danny. This last topic that you have mentioned, quoting Bauer and Mose, I believe it's very important to mention. At the beginning, I was stating that when we look at the development of this ideological, theoretical corpus that's being developed in the world and the structures at the political and social level, I would like to state that this session was very dense, and we have a very big problem right now that we're running out of time. We have an hour and a half. We have like 4 more minutes left. And I see Noah back there reminding us that we should be concluding. I do want to say that an option that we could have is to organize, be it within ISGAP or within another framework that we also have access to, that we should continue this exchange. I think that it has been very fruitful. There have been very important topics. I think that to beginning, that we're really challenging the idea we all have of what Michel mentioned, the public space, the public debate that is becoming more ethnic, that is losing the civic criteria of argumentation. or what we
hay un
mentioned,
activismo que ha
that
sustituido la
there is
posibilidad
an activism
que
right now
reclamaba
that is no
Leonardo,
longer
la
allowing
palabra,
what
el
Leonardo
poder de la
mentioned,
palabra.
the power
Finalmente,
of the word.
el antisemitismo se
Finally,
construye realmente, es
anti-Semitism is
discursivo,
constructed. It's part of
se
discourse,
reproduce, se
it's
construye
reproduced, it's
y permea de un
constructed,
modo latente,
and it's
difuso,
latent
manifiesto
very
la
slowly but
sociedad.
manifestly
Creo que tenemos
into
aquí retomando
society.
inclusive
So,
sesiones
bringing
previas
back
de arriba
previous
hacia
sessions
abajo, de
that we've
abajo
had,
hacia
it
arriba
goes
y
top
extendido, ¿no
bottom,
es
bottom
cierto? Creo
top,
que
and it's been also
eh,
extended.
señalaba Sergio los diferentes frentes,
So,
¿correcto?
Sergio was mentioning the
Y
different
yo
fronts,
intenté aludir a
and
ello al
I tried
principio, que
to mention
el
this at the
frente
beginning.
básicamente de la palabra,
The front
de la circulación de
of
los
the
tropos
word,
negativos,
the
ha
circulation of negative
realmente
tropes.
compensado y
This has really
contrarrestado lo que podríamos
compensated
llamar una estrategia
and
militar
fought
contenidora
against
asumido
this
el Estado de
military
Israel. Entonces,
strategy that the state
estamos
of
frente a
Israel
esta
has had to assume.
situación de
So we are right now in
desaliento
this situation
o
where we feel
aislamiento,
discouraged, where
correcto,
we feel
que me he
isolated.
tratado. Creo que no tenemos más
I
tiempo.
don't think we have any
Déjenme
more
tomar
time
estos
left.
minutos para
Let me just use
agradecerles a
these last
ustedes,
minutes to
todos
thank all
queridos
of you,
colegas con quienes
dear
hemos podido
colleagues,
dialogar previamente y
who we
seguiremos
have been able
dialogando.
to speak with before
Quiero
and we will continue
agradecerle
talking
a
to.
todos
I
aquellos
want to
colegas que
thank all of the
participaron
colleagues
previamente
who
y
were
que no
part of this
necesariamente
series
los veo hoy,
previously.
pero
And
bueno,
I don't see all of you
recibirán nuestro
here, but they will
agradecimiento.
receive our thanks
Está
and
con
our appreciation.
nosotros
We
Heidi,
have
que
here
ha sido una
Heidi,
intérprete
who
maravillosa
has been
junto con
a
Sharona, su
wonderful
compañera
interpreter together with
amablemente
Sharona,
permitido que
her
podamos hacer
colleague, and they have allowed us to
esta
have
traducción
this
simultánea y alcanzar
simultaneous
públicos que
interpretation
no
and be able
hablan
to reach
el
the
español.
public who does not speak Spanish.
Quiero agradecer
I
a
also
Noah,
want to
que ha
thank
sido
Noah,
realmente, como dije desde el
who has
principio,
been
un
from the
colaborador
very
excelente, con
beginning, has done
iniciativas, con
excellent work.
eficiencia
His initiative,
total,
he's been so
ISGAP,
efficient. I
y
want to thank
a
ISGAP
Charles
and
Small,
Charles
que
Small, who
nos envía un
has
saludo a todos.
who
Él
sends
está hoy
greetings to all.
ocupado, no va a
He
estar, nos
was
acompañó
busy
al
today. He
inicio,
couldn't join us today. He
y
did join us at
decirles
the
que,
beginning. And I want to
bueno,
tell of
cerramos
you
un nuevo ciclo.
that we're concluding this new
Algunas
cycle.
preguntas nos
I-
acompañan, otras,
We
la
still
verdad es
have some
que
questions
con
that we're
toda la
taking with
humildad que
us.
tenemos frente a
And
una
well,
realidad compleja,
with our
tenemos que
humility, looking
repensar
at this
también
complex
muchos de los
reality, we do
conceptos
have
que
to
hemos
rethink many of the
desarrollado
concepts that we
y
have
también
developed.
ver la posibilidad
And we
de,
also
creo
want to
yo,
see
crear puentes
if it's
entre lo que
possible
la
to create
investigación y el
bridges
pensamiento nos provoca
between what
y los
research and
liderazgos
thought
comunitarios,
is
nacionales e
giving us and
internacionales
the
puedan
leadership
abordar.
at the
Creo que todo
national
el
and
tema de la
international level.
complejidad
I do believe that
surglobal
this
lo
complexity
hemos
of
abordado, lo
the
hemos trabajado, lo estamos
subglobal
haciendo y sin
issues, we have
embargo
been working on this.
esos puentes,
And
digamos,
those
donde el
bridges,
conocimiento se hace
we need those
práctica,
bridges where
no
knowledge
necesariamente se han
becomes
construido.
a
Tal vez
practice,
una
is
última
something that hasn't
consideración en
really happened. We
carácter
don't have those bridges.
interdisciplinario de
And
las
also, I want to talk about
intervenciones,
the
el
interdisciplinary
carácter
character
también
of all the presentations.
transnacional,
Also,
como
the
decía Michel,
transnational
correcto, estamos
character
todos
of
en
these
diferentes lugares
presentations.
del
Just like
mundo,
Michelle said, we're
a
all located in
nuestros
different places of
colegas
the
que están
world.
en
Our
Israel, que nos
colleagues in
hablaron y quienes
Israel,
nos oyen,
who also spoke,
todo
those of you
nuestro
who are
solidaridad,
listening to us,
apoyo,
please, you have our solidarity,
los
our
problemas
support,
políticos internos,
the
Sergio, que
internal
señalaste,
political
ahí
problems
están.
that you mentioned,
El
Sergio,
dictum
are
del
there.
pueblo decide del primer ministro
This
nos arroja también a un
dictum that the
escenario
people will decide, the prime
político
minister is
preocupante.
really showing us a
Los
very concerning
nexos entre
political
Israel y las comunidades
situation,
judías,
the relationship
las
between Israel
diásporas
and the Jewish
globales,
communities, the global
transnacionales, en
diasporas, the
fin,
transnational
un
diasporas.
universo
This
de
is a universe
les agradezco
of
mucho.
challenges. I want to thank
Estamos
all
2
of you.
minutos más allá del
We've
tiempo
gone
con
2
esta
minutes
puntualidad
beyond
que
our
debemos
time,
tener. Me
and we really
despido
have
con
to be
mi
on time. I
cariño
want
muy
to say
fuerte
goodbye,
y nos
all
estamos
my appreciation,
conectando. Hay
and we
un
shall meet
compromiso,
again.
debo
We
decirles,
do
un
have
aplauso
this
a todos
commitment,
ustedes,
and I
y
want
es que
to give a
podamos
big
sacar
applause
unas
to all of you
memorias.
that we do have
O
this
bien
commitment. We
memorias,
want
que
to
sería lo
publish
más
some sort of
inmediato, o bien
memory,
un
some
libro
sort of
donde las
publication,
ponencias
maybe a book,
sean
where we are
traducidas en
able to
artículos, o sea,
translate,
sean
convert these
completadas con artículos. Lo
presentations,
estamos
and that they
explorando.
are published as
Gracias a todos
chapters.
entonces,
So
correcto.
thank you
Se
all.
cuidan. Nos van
So
a
please take care.
desconectar en un
We'll
segundo.
be
Noah es
unplugged in
implacable.
a second from now. Noah
Cuídense.
is very strict. Take care. Goodbye.